thank you very much for adopting me as an honorary Barcelonanian. It's been a real pleasure ever since I came to attend an IEMed event back in December. And I think it provides an excellent opportunity for us to have a meaningful discussion of this report, which is really what this is meant to be. This is not an event for publicity, it's an event for discussion. And we really appreciate the fact that you've managed to bring together quite a distinguished audience that I think would be able to help us enrich the report further through the comments that they give. I just want to provide some background to the report and explain why you have the cast of characters that you have in front of you right now presenting the report. Unfortunately, particularly in the southern Mediterranean region, there is a huge tendency for people to look at things in a highly compartmentalized manner. So you have people who write reports as economists, people who write reports as political scientists, as sociologists, what have you, but they typically find it very difficult to talk together. This report is a truly multidisciplinary report. It has been written, put together by a multidisciplinary team of economists, political scientists, who mutually understand each other. And the reason why we have Abdallah with us is because, again, we didn't want this to be yet another report written by people who think about how things should be done. We wanted to get a taste of reality. And Abdallah, as somebody who had very senior policy-making portfolio until quite recently, provided that reality check. Is what we are saying doable or not? Because, again, the idea was not to come up with yet another report for the shelf. This is not a report that we want to put on the shelf. It's a report that we want to be used, and so far the reactions we've got have been very positive. The event that we had in Egypt last week for a reading of the report with an Arab audience was very lively, and we already see interest by political parties in actually looking at what this report has to offer, to look at different options, to see their choices. And that's really the main purpose of this report. It's not to... And the messages, the report has two key messages. Lino, in a sense, referred to the second message, that is that a different economic outcome is possible. The region does have the wealth and the resources to be much more courageous in the development path that it follows. But equally important, in a day where there is a lot of focus on political issues, is for us to realize that political inclusion alone, political change alone, will not be sustainable. It absolutely has to be supplemented by a new economic structure, by a new process of economic inclusion. So those are really the two key messages that we want to take with you, that yes, political inclusion is important. The whole notion of the developmental state that we advocate for in this report is not the East Asian model of authoritarian regimes that pushed through a developmental agenda. It's a state that is also open and accountable to its citizens. So the political side is definitely there. But in this region, the economic issues are so important that no political process can be sustained without quick attention to the economic underpinnings of the protest movement. And that's the main message I want to take. Having said that, I'll pass the floor to Abdallah to start the process of talking about the report properly. Please.
I have this one. Thank you very much, Mohammad. Mohammad and Noha will be speaking. The three of us will be speaking about this report. I'd like to thank you again for giving us this opportunity. We would like to highlight a number of basic facts in the region. I am not even sure that the cross-cutting of these basic facts have led to the Arab Spring. We are not explaining how did the Arab Spring take place. It is not a cause-effect relationship. We are just going to explain to you what was the socio-political and economic situation that prevailed in the Arab world before January 2011, and what we believe should be the systemic structural changes that should take place in our part of the world to meet the expectations of its streets, and especially its youth. The region, as I'm sure you know, has been characterized by exclusion. Exclusion from political life, exclusion from economic life, exclusion from access to physical capital, to social capital, especially quality social capital of health and education. The relationship between the state, the citizen, and the economy was not functioning, and in fact, I cannot even say that there was a functioning state as we know it, a functioning economy as we know it, and a citizenship as we know it. The economy was dominated by a number of cronies who had connections to the political power. The political power was closed and exclusionary, and the citizen, as a citizen, did not exist. We had subjects, and the subjects were looked upon in their masses rather than as individuals who have rights and duties. So the connection between the state, the citizen, and the economy was not functioning, and the functioning of the state, the economy, and citizenship was not happening. So you had this process, and you have the manifestations of this exclusionary political economy in the form of, if I give you some numbers, only 30% of the Arab workforce had any sort of social protection. The informal economy dominated most of the out of the government economic activities in the region. Most of the access to finance in the region went to only 200 companies. Think about it. Only 200 Arab companies got more than 40% of total credit in the region, while at the same time the region today has excess liquidity in its banks of $440 billion sitting there while youth unemployment is rising. Youth unemployment in the Arab world is one of the highest in the world, and women's labor participation is the lowest in the world. These are just signs of an economy and a society that was not sustainable. Things were not possible to continue as they were in the past, despite the fact that the region had achieved some of the fastest economic growing rates in the world in the past 10 years, and some of the fastest job creation rates in the region. It was not a jobless growth, but it was a growth based on informal jobs, a growth based on low-quality jobs, and based on two major sectors: extraction, oil and gas, or low-value-added services. The region has been seeing deindustrialization in the past 30 years. For example, the share of manufacturing in Egypt's economy in 1971 was larger than it was in 2010. So it has been seeing deindustrialization, low-value-added services, and oil and gas extraction. This is not a structure of an economy that can compete in a competitive open global economy. It is not a structure of economy that attracts young men to learn and then enter in a competitive labor market. It was not that jobs were not created, but the dilemma of the Arab worker, the Arab young man and woman, is that they were afraid from tomorrow. They had no security whatsoever on the day after. What will happen tomorrow morning? I have an informal job that has no social security or protection whatsoever. The fear of tomorrow the fear of falling into poverty, the fear of falling into unemployment, and Europe is suffering from that a little bit now. That fear is worse than poverty and unemployment itself. It drives you to the streets probably more than poverty itself. Exclusion was manifest in the macroeconomic structure of our region, and you could see that there was clear disparities between the Arab sub-region. Look at internal Tunisia and coastal Tunisia. Look at Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Look at the growth versus inequality. You can see that the Gini coefficient in the region has been increasing with the growth rates of GDP have been increasing. You can see that most of the jobs have been created, as I said, in the informal sector without any, and we had natural resource mismanagement that we will talk about in a little bit. We had a path of development that was environmentally unsustainable, politically exclusive, economically uncompetitive, and based on a number of cronies who were connected to the regimes. I always say a little anecdote that even those cronies did not believe in the longevity of their regimes. They did not invest in long-term industrial projects or in research and development. They invested in short-term, quick wins, like in real estate, like in tourism, and you are suffering from that in Spain, with the focus on real estate in most of the activities of investments. That does not create a productive economy. And if these cronies believed that their regimes were going to last, they would have invested in long term. But that is a strong economic signal. In economics, we believe in signals. That was a very strong economic signal that even those guys did not believe in the longevity of the political systems that made them who were there, who they were. I think now we need you to see the facts, and Mohammad will be more than willing to provide you with the numbers and the facts on this exclusionary economics. Please, Mohammad.
Okay. Well, actually, the thing is that before I give the numbers, it's important to bear in mind that phenomena don't always mean the same thing everywhere. And one of the things that we have said in the report is that we are trying to go beyond numbers, because numbers can hide many times much more than what they reveal. Therefore, they have to be taken in the context. For example, when we talk about unemployment rates in the Arab region and compare them to the unemployment rates in Europe, don't forget that those who are even supposedly employed don't enjoy any social protection. So unemployment means a very different process there. It means that this person does not even have the opportunity of setting up a stall someplace, because so long as he has a stall someplace and he's not actively looking for work, he does not count as unemployed. So the figures have to be taken with a huge pinch of salt, and they underestimate the extent of true deprivation. Having said that, we do know that the Arab region has one of the lowest rates of labor force participation, particularly for women. The labor force participation rate for women in the Arab region is 26%, half the global average. And most of the participation that there is again in the agricultural sector, where it's not paid. Most of it is in family labor. So you have a situation where women are getting increasingly educated but don't have opportunities to enter the labor market, which shows itself in also a very high rate of self-employment in non-agricultural activities. Again, to go back to Abdullah, the structure of the economy was not creating what we can consider to be quality jobs. There are huge rural-urban disparities, and these have persisted through a long period, so that the benefits of development have not trickled down. I mean, there's a lot of talk about the trickle down, but for the past 50 years, the trickle down hasn't happened. Maybe it will happen in the next 200 years, but I don't think people are going to wait that long for that. And to get the point about data, we observe that there is rising inequality in the Arab region, but data, unfortunately, does not capture it, because the data that we use to measure inequality is based on consumption. And consumption within the Arab region is much more equal than income and wealth because of the way mechanisms of social solidarity work. And this is reflected in the fact that the consumption levels that we get from consumption surveys are 1/3 the consumption levels we get based on national income accounts. What does that tell us? That tells us that the missing 60% plus of consumption is attributable to the top 5% of the population that we typically cannot capture. So while the Gini coefficients might appear fairly low, even though rising slightly, as Abdallah said, but they're still very low if you go by the formal figures. But the reality of inequality in the Arab region is very much in the order of what you see in Latin America. Without that, you cannot explain what you see behind you, in front of your eyes in the Arab region. And the development that there has been, with all its faults, has been based on destroying the foundation on which this development is based. It has come at the expense of destroying the environment in country after country. I mean, just across the straits in Morocco, you can see that. You see it in very high rates of energy intensity of production. The region has one of the highest. And even in a country like Saudi Arabia, with its production of 10 million barrels of oil a day, if they continue at the current rate of consumption, in about 30 years or so, they'll run out of oil. So there's no way that the current pattern of consumption growth can continue, because it's based on eating up the environment rather than using the environment. The region increasingly has problems even providing drinking water to its population because of mismanagement. And this is largely mismanagement. Environmental, climate change and these things, of course, don't help either, because you're having increasingly more volatile production of food. And again, you see it. Morocco is a very interesting example where the production of agriculture can go up and down twice or three times, like from 5% of GDP to 15%, then down, then up. And this kind of volatility plays major havoc and creates huge uncertainty. But all of these things have not happened simply because of the workings of some invisible hand. No, these have resulted from conscious acts of human beings, which are due to the way the region has been governed. And to discuss the governance issues, I asked my colleague Noha to take over.
Exactly. So as Mohammad and Abdallah were going on and on trying to highlight to you the main features of the economic development failures of the past, I was thinking all along that hasn't been an accident. That has been almost by design. And the design is the governance relations between ruler and ruled that has some features common to most Arab countries, with variations, of course, from one country to another, because countries have their own historical specificity. but the report looks at the commonalities in the governance structures and processes of the Arab region and comes up with 5 main features of governance that have made all these development challenges not an accident but a result of, number 1, executive institutions that over the past 30 years more and more got captured by particular private interest. Hence, the public executive decisions tended to serve the interest of private people and groups rather than the public interest, which is what executive branches of government are supposed to defend, the public interest. We call this in the report the captured nature of executive institutions. They have become captured by private interests of particular groups of entrepreneurs and private interests of particular groups of state apparatchiks as well as ruling families of the Arab world. The second feature of governance relations that resulted in the development failures, making them by design and not by accident, is the mirror effect of the captured national institutions, which takes place at the local level. Local government institutions and local elected councils in almost all Arab countries, with very few exceptions, have not been able to represent the voices of the people in the local communities, and hence national policy circles had no corrective mechanism of any kind. Because in the final analysis, social services such as education and health and water hit people very much at the community level, the local level of government. And that is the place where you need a lot of representative governance relations, representative institutions to move the voice of the people and suggestions from the people up to correct public policy. This local level of processes of correction tends to be, on the whole, quite weak in the Arab region, with very few exceptions, as I said. The third feature is the role of the judiciary in the Arab countries. Very many Arab countries, and also that gets reflected in global indicators of governance, very many Arab countries boast in the independence of their judiciary. You find it written in the constitutions that the judiciary has to be independent and is independent. But when we observed the development failures, we realized one very important feature of the judiciary in the Arab world that perpetuates that exclusion that Abdallah and Mohammad were talking about, namely the weakness of judicial activism in protecting and enforcing collective rights that we call social and economic rights. The judiciary is good and independent when it comes to criminal court cases, one citizen against another. But when it comes to protecting all citizens' social and economic rights, the judiciary in the Arab world lacks that activism that we see pioneering real change in other parts of the world, such as India, with its extremely innovative constitutional support of people's right to development, right to food, right to employment, etc., etc. One before last feature is the fact that over the past 30 years or so, Arab citizens, when polled in public opinion surveys, became increasingly alienated from the society and from the state. So much so that one of the regional human development reports of UNDP polled and surveyed the opinions of young Arabs, and if any of you have read that report, you will remember the shocking finding that over 50% of Arabs want to immigrate because they feel alienated from that society. Where is that coming from, the alienation from your own society? We say that primarily it has a lot to do with the fact that elections never brought to power legitimate regimes in the Arab world. And it is no accident that the 2010 elections in Egypt was the most fraudulent election, and 4 months later Egyptians went out on the street because it was just a very final indicator of how much that main democratic mechanism called elections is not helping the people get legitimate governments to power. And finally, the last challenge in governance that makes all of what you heard not an accident is the fact that all the mechanisms that supposedly resolve conflict between people in society, because change and development are conflictive by nature. Development is not a peaceful process anywhere in the world. But the difference is some societies have mechanisms to resolve the conflicts between people, such as labor unions, such as farmers' unions, such as civil society organizations that represent people's voice. These have all been controlled by the state in the Arab region. Hence, we stand now at a point where a lot of the Arab awakening is happening out in the streets of Maidan al-Tahrir and al-Qasba, but not through the institutions that are supposedly meant to regulate and manage conflict. I give the floor back to Mohammad to tell us how do we get out of this challenging situation, because the report says there is a way to get out of this challenging situation.
Okay. Mohammad? Yes, please. Yeah. The thing is that our principal recommendation is to go for a changed role for the state, to actually have the state as a promoter of development, what we call the developmental state model, which has to be based on a clearly articulated development vision, which knows exactly where it wants to take society and takes responsibility for making proper use of resources that are available. A new social contract of mutual accountability. This is why I said that our report very much takes a multidisciplinary approach. So you can see that we go from economic to political and back and forth, because that's the way life is as well. Life is not nicely compartmentalized. So you absolutely need to have a new social contract of mutual accountability between state and citizen, so that promises are actually kept. Because otherwise, in terms of public declarations, there's been no dearth of declarations that, of good intentions, but the results are not there to support it. The state, I mean, a developmental state on the East Asian model was a capable state, but not necessarily accountable. For us, the state has to be absolutely accountable and capable as well. It's not enough for it to be capable. The accountability mechanisms, I leave my colleague to talk about, but and it absolutely has to have an inclusive political system. As far as economic issues are concerned, it has to be based on a competitive and open market, which actually allows people to come in and go out, not a market that is open only for those few who are politically well connected. And the growth process has to change radically to become employment-focused and regionally balanced. And to cap it all off, it has to happen within the context of regional integration. Europe is a very good example of how, in the modern day of globalization, it's entities that have some integration at a lower level that have managed to do better in competing globally. Now, what are the kind of main policy shifts that have to be there on the economic policy front to bring about this new vision? First, the structure of the economy has to be radically transformed. How do you do this? There are tools available, and the report does focus a lot in offering suggestions based on concrete experience from other places. I mean, this is not an academic report. I mean, industrial policy has been much maligned, saying, oh, you're interfering with the market. But most countries that have grown based on having a clear policy of what it is that they want to do, what industries they want to support, how they want to support it, within the rules, within the commitments that they have. I mean, we're not saying that you need to renege on commitments, but you can keep the commitments and yet have a clear conscious policy. And promote particular, we are also not against the service sector. I mean, the service sector has a huge role to play in any modern economy. But it's what kind of service sector? You need to have a policy to promote high value-added service sectors. Not a situation, I was actually talking to a Greek friend of mine the other day who was complaining, saying that in Greece people were actually trained down to lose good manufacturing jobs and go for much lower paid service sector jobs. No, that's not the kind of growth we want. We want people to have good quality service sector jobs. And with an increasingly educated labor force, it's possible to do that by moving towards a knowledge economy. We are very much pushing for progressive taxation. I mean, there's a lot of debate that this discourages your willingness to work on these things, but there are limits. I mean, the things that we're not suggesting 90% taxation, but there has to be some element of social justice thrown into economic policies. And particularly wealth, because the problem is that one reason why in our economies we get so much focus on the real estate business is because people don't pay any taxes on property. So by getting taxes on property, you can both reduce inequality, reduce the incentive for people to engage in activities which are not particularly helpful and job creating, and also use the proceeds to fund badly needed social payments. You need to create space for consumer and worker activism so that the market is controlled. You don't have a situation of workers' pay being reduced to zero, which reduces total demand in the country, and shoddy goods being produced which have no opportunity of competing globally. And the state also has to ensure that quality basic social services are provided. Again, and there are examples of how this can be done. On the macroeconomic front, unfortunately, with the global dominance of finance capital, what you have is the focus of all macroeconomic policies is on controlling inflation, and that's it. As if this was the only thing you needed to worry about. You definitely do not want runaway inflation. I mean, we are not suggesting that at all. But public policy, macroeconomic policies, has a major role to play in creating sufficient demand to have all the people who are in an economy occupied. So we're definitely suggesting expansionary fiscal policy, but not to use that money for any purpose. I mean, you need to use that money wisely so that the expenditure reduces major bottlenecks that are faced by private sector. So that, because otherwise you definitely will run into inflation. The policies have to focus on employment as a major objective, not just growth. And in order to achieve employment, there are also practical things that we suggest here, like, for example, revising public procurement procedures to ensure that local producers can have a better chance at providing services and goods that are required by the public sector. Financial intermediation, I mean, the point that Abdallah mentioned about most of the finance going to a few companies. By improving the way the financial sector works. And again, there are many examples where through providing incentives, you can get the banks to lend to a large number of small and medium enterprises who have been shown globally to be the engines of job creation. It's those companies that really create jobs everywhere. Regional integration, Abdallah will talk about. We also need to have a particular policy in terms of balancing subnational development. Because if you just leave it to the economy, to the sort of invisible hands of the market, it does not happen. The invisible hands of the market mean that new companies go and set up where all the companies have set up, because this is where they get all support services. The only way you can get more regional balance is by some public involvement in making it profitable for companies to go and set up in areas which are less developed. And Europe has a lot to show to the Arab region in terms of how this can be done. And Spain, in particular, has benefited a lot from support that was provided to promote more regionally balanced development. And if you don't get that, you don't get the social cohesion. You absolutely have to have more regionally balanced development. The environment, again, we cannot continue to mine the environment. The Arab region has huge potential in terms of sustainable energy. And it's good to have Lino, because I know, for example, the Union for the Moderation is very much interested in promoting alternative energies. I mean, there is a lot that can be done to generate jobs in a sustainable way by using the abundant sun that exists in the Arab region. And also, critically, to revise pricing, both on energy, where a lot of countries provide highly regressive subsidies on fuel, which lead to wrong choices in terms of economic structure and limit the ability of the state to spend on badly needed social expenditures. And water pricing is also a critical issue. Most of the water in the Arab region is wasted in agriculture, and then the reason why it's used so abundantly is because you have politically powerful agricultural lobbies that stop meaningful pricing of water. So without meaningful pricing of water, you can't go anywhere. Abdallah,
thank you. I would like, before moving to regional integration, just to give some practical examples of what Mohammad was saying about the nature of the economy. You know, the Arab economy, as we said, is based either on oil, which represents until today 70% of total Arab GDP, or on export-led growth, export of low-value services and of cheaper products, cheaper manufactured goods, like in Tunisia or in Morocco or in Egypt. And that competitiveness of these products is based on suppression of costs, especially labor cost. So when the international crisis in 2008 hit the global economy, there was no domestic demand instead of the external demand that was lost during the international crisis. Domestic demand was suppressed deliberately in order to increase competitiveness of Arab exporters, rather than through lower labor costs, rather than through improved competitiveness and high input-output ratio in production. Therefore, the structure of the economy, of course, could not create new jobs, especially for highly skilled workers. The Arab region, not as many people think, it has a bad educational system or a low number of university graduates. By the way, all Arabs, when they immigrate and do very well in countries like Spain or France or the United States. How come when there is demand for their skills, they do very well, and in their countries they don't? It's actually the structure of the economy, which is based on cost suppression, which is based on labor cost suppression especially. So they don't see a hope for the future in finding good quality jobs. The other issue that Mohammad raised, which is very important, is the question of the rural-urban disparities. 50% of Arabs live in the countryside. Only 10 to 12% of Arab GDP is agriculture. And therefore, and most of the Arab poor are living in the countryside. The role of agricultural policy and integrated rural, comprehensive rural development policy is crucial for the success of any development strategies in the region. And I want to give you an example about water scarcity and bad economics. In Yemen, which has one of the poorest water countries in the world, the average is 100 cubic meters per person per year of renewable water. That precious water is being pumped using very heavily subsidized diesel to produce qat. Do you know what qat is? It's a drug that people consume in Yemen. So very limited water resources are being pumped irrationally using very limited diesel resources and very heavily subsidized diesel to get rid of agricultural products that are productive, like fruits, vegetables, and wheat, to plant a drug. Just imagine that vicious circle of unsustainability and bad economics. The state in Yemen had given cheap diesel to their friends and allies to continue pumping diesel, water using cheap diesel to produce qat and get stoned. That is the deliberate policies that Noha has been talking about. It is not by coincidence. It is not by chance. After having said all of this about the Arab region, we think that all the solutions for our problems exist in our region. That's not saying we don't want to work with Europe. We definitely do want to work with Europe and as part of the Mediterranean. But the countries in the region have labor surplus and labor deficit. They have fiscal surplus and fiscal deficits. We have countries that have fiscal deficits but food potential, and we have countries that have fiscal surplus and food deficits. We have, and so on. So regional integration is a crucial success factor in any proposal that we are putting on the table. And the report is very clear about this. And we go one step beyond and say, if after the events of 2011, Arab regimes don't realize the need for regional integration, the infection of this revolution will not stop at any borders. And it will continue to be widespread across all of the region. Therefore, regional integration between different Arab countries has become a question of national security for countries with surplus and even for countries with deficit. The Arab region enjoys a unique position, is that its solutions are within its borders, and we can do that through much better, and that's what the report is proposing. However, if we don't fix the governance issue on the local level in each Arab country, we cannot fix the governance of regional integration. You cannot integrate governments that are badly governed. You can only integrate governments that are well governed. So the governance challenge and what we are proposing in the report for governance, we go back to Noha, our governance specialist.
The report has a number of clear and concrete recommendations on improving governance in the Arab region in order to arrive at the developmental state that Mohammad and Abdallah were mentioning to you. Very quickly, the first recommendation has already happened, and that is opening public space for Arabs to make their point. This they have done already themselves. Grabbing public space has happened by Arabs, especially the Arab young, and that's why we call it an Arab awakening, not just an Arab spring. And let me give you a gist of this Arab awakening. Spain is a football country, and I'm proud to be a supporter of national team of Spain whenever they play the World Championship of Soccer. At one point in time, Egyptians in Tahrir Square last year were all standing there very late at night, asking themselves, If we win our revolution, are we going to meet Tunisia in the final of revolutionary World Cups? That wasn't just a joke. It was actually giving you the spirit of constructive competition that has happened now in the Arab region by the young who are opening up space for themselves to express themselves. And this is, in our mind, the first practical, positive, constructive requirement for governance change and governance reform in the Arab world. Beyond that, the report mentions some recommendations. I'll go through them very quickly with you. Number one, the report says Arabs are writing constitutions, and those constitutions have to take care of the rights of women, as well as the rights of the poor and marginalized. Number two, Arabs are going through elections, and these elections need to be credible through independent election management bodies. Number three, Arabs need to be able to deal with the past, rest it, and move forward. And dealing with the past, we mean violations of human rights that happened in the past. And this is a process called transitional justice process, where you punish who deserves to be punished, you forgive those who admit to their mistakes publicly, and you move on by institutional reforms to make sure what happened in the past never happens again. And then, after these immediate recommendations, the report mentions some few longer-term recommendations, such as making sure the legislatures, the parliaments of the Arab world develop the capacity for oversight of budgets in the Arab world. The budget process tends to be very, very opaque and non-transparent. To lead to all what you have heard so far, it has to have something to do with the budget process. Parliaments have to have the oversight over that process. The judiciary has to be able to be accessible to all Arab citizens whenever they want the judge to come to their rescue and protection. And there needs to be a lot more work on democracy on the local level in the Arab world, not only on the national level. And finally, civil society needs to continue to have its space without temptation of control, because if it's not for political parties and unions and professional associations, Arabs will continue to use the street because they have no other means of resolving their differences.
Let me just conclude by, because I'm giving some ideas in terms of how Europe could support an Arab development model, given the fact that we're having this discussion in a European setting. These points are not in the report, but you can logically extract them from the report, because in terms of how it is that Europe can help. Definitely Europe can serve as a very good example that we can follow by sharing experiences, because the experience of Europe in combating sub-regional and sub-national disparities is something which is worth sharing so that the Arab region can learn from it. Definitely, when I was very happy that Mr. Lino talked about trade. About trade. Now, the thing is that there needs to be space for trade, because if these new democracies are going to develop and be able to get their footing, they need to be able to export their goods. And Europe, as the bigger neighbor, can be magnanimous and allow more access to its markets, both for goods, services, and people. I mean, it's a reality that people as well, I mean, every day they are crossing the straits to come over to this side. And rather than it being kind of criminal activity, one needs to look at ways. And there are already steps that have been taken that one can build on the secular migration issues. And use the agreements that already are in place to actually support transformative change. Because a lot of the agreements that Europe has concluded with countries in the southern Mediterranean have provisions, but the problem is that they are sort of isolated provisions. If one can look at how the different provisions are linked together and use regional programs as incentives to try and find something similar to the Copenhagen criterion in EU accession to support the process of transformation in the Arab region. I think that would be very helpful.
I have, one proposal for the Institute, which we need desperately. We are trying to develop a human-centered economics. How could a growth equation change from GDP and GDP per capita to a growth equation with decent jobs and human dignity at the core of new mathematical economics? This is an exercise we are trying to develop, and we need the Institute to help us with that. So if you do that, I think it would be beneficial for Europe and for the Arab region. Thank you very much.
Yes.